moving truck's engine cut through the quiet morning air like a knife. But it wasn't the sound that made Rachel Harper's hands tremble as she turned the key in the front door of her new home. It was the feeling, the unmistakable sensation that somewhere, behind lace curtains and pristine hedges, someone was watching. Someone who had already decided she didn't belong here. Have you ever worked your entire life for something, only to have a stranger try to take it away in less than 24 hours? Rachel stood on the porch of 1847 Maple Grove Lane, her 5-year-old daughter Maya clutching her hand, and allowed herself a single moment to breathe. The house was beautiful, a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a garden that desperately needed attention but held so much promise. It had taken 15 years of double shifts at the hospital, sacrificed vacations, and a determination that bordered on obsession to save enough for the down payment. This wasn't just a house. It was proof. Proof that the little girl from the East Side projects could build something lasting. Something her daughter wouldn't have to fight so hard to achieve. The neighborhood was everything the realtor had promised. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, an elementary school just 3 blocks away with test scores that made Rachel's heart sing. She'd driven past this area for years on her way to work, always wondering what it would feel like to actually live somewhere like this. Now she was about to find out. "Mommy, can I pick which room is mine?" Maya's voice pulled her back to the present. Rachel smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Any room you want, baby. Except the master, of course." They stepped inside together, their footsteps echoing through empty rooms that smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. The movers were already hauling boxes up the walkway, their grunts of effort a rhythmic soundtrack to this life-changing day. Rachel moved through each room slowly, mentally placing furniture, imagining Maya's laughter bouncing off these walls, picturing quiet Sunday mornings with coffee and sunlight streaming through those beautiful bay windows. She was standing in what would become the living room, arms crossed, smiling at the built-in bookshelves when she heard it. A sharp knock at the door. Not friendly, not welcoming, aggressive. Rachel's smile faded slightly as she walked back through the hallway. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, she could make out a figure. Someone tall, standing with a posture that radiated authority, or at least the perception of it. She opened the door to find a woman in her mid-60s glaring at her from the porch. The woman was impeccably dressed, cream-colored slacks, a pressed blouse, pearl earrings that caught the morning light. Her silver hair was styled in a way that probably required weekly salon appointments. Everything about her screamed maintenance and control, but it was her eyes that struck Rachel the hardest. Cold, calculating, already passing judgment. "Can I help you?" Rachel kept her voice pleasant, professional, the tone she used at work when dealing with difficult patients or their families. The woman didn't return the courtesy. "I'm Barbara Whitmore. I live next door." She gestured vaguely to the house on the right, a sprawling property with a manicured lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine. "And I think there's been a mistake." Rachel felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she maintained her smile. "I'm sorry. This house." Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line. "It was supposed to be purchased by the Hendersons, a lovely couple from the country club. I was quite close with the previous owners and they assured me—" "I'm the new owner," Rachel interrupted gently but firmly. "Rachel Harper. I closed on the property 3 days ago. Everything is legal and final." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "I see." The way she said it made those 2 words carry the weight of volumes. "Well, I'm sure you understand that this is a very particular neighborhood. We have certain standards here, community guidelines, aesthetic requirements. We maintain a specific quality of life, and everyone who lives here is expected to uphold that." Rachel's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes. She'd heard this song before, different melody, same lyrics. "I'm familiar with the HOA bylaws." I reviewed them thoroughly before making my offer. Did you? Barbara tilted her head, and there was something almost predatory in the gesture. Because I've served as the HOA president for 12 years, and I can assure you there are many unwritten rules that are just as important as the written ones. This neighborhood has a certain character, a certain type of resident who fits in here. I'd hate for you to invest all this time and money only to find yourself uncomfortable, unwelcome. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Maya appeared behind Rachel's legs, peeking out at the strange woman with curious eyes. Barbara's gaze shifted to the little girl, and something flickered across her face. Not quite disgust, not quite fear. Something in between that made Rachel's protective instincts flare like a wildfire. My daughter and I will be very comfortable here, Rachel said, her voice dropping several degrees in temperature. But thank you for your concern. Barbara reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a business card, pressing it into Rachel's hand with more force than necessary. When the problems start, and they will start, you'll want this. It's the number for a very good real estate attorney. He specializes in helping people exit difficult property situations. Consider it a courtesy. She turned to leave, then paused on the top step, glancing back over her shoulder. Oh, and Ms. Harper, I'd advise you not to get too comfortable. Not yet. Rachel stood in the doorway long after Barbara disappeared back into her pristine fortress next door. The business card felt heavy in her hand, heavier than simple paper had any right to be. Maya tugged at her shirt. Mommy, is that lady mean? Rachel knelt down, pulling her daughter close. Some people are just unhappy, baby. It has nothing to do with us. But as she said the words, she wondered if she was trying to convince Maya or herself. She looked down at the business card again. Walter Brennan-esque, property disputes and residential law. The edges were sharp, professionally cut, expensive. The kind of thing someone kept on hand because they used it often. Rachel tore it in half and dropped it in the empty box sitting by the door. She had no intention of going anywhere. This was her home, her dream, her daughter's future. And if Barbara Whitmore thought she could intimidate her way into changing that, she was about to learn a very important lesson about underestimating people. What Rachel didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she returned to unpacking boxes and imagining her new life in this house, was that Barbara's visit was just the opening move. That by nightfall, there would be a citation taped to her mailbox. That by the end of the week, she'd receive a formal letter demanding she vacate the property. That Barbara Whitmore had connections, resources, and a determination that matched Rachel's own. And neither woman had any idea that the truth about this house, about this street, about the very ground they were fighting over, was about to surface in a way that would change everything. Retry VT. The citation appeared at 7:15 the following morning, stapled to Rachel's mailbox with the kind of aggressive precision that felt personal. She discovered it while still in her scrubs, having just returned from a 12-hour shift that had left her exhausted and running on nothing but coffee and determination. The paper fluttered in the early breeze, official-looking with the HOA letterhead prominently displayed at the top. Violation Code 3.7, Unapproved Exterior Modifications. Violation Code 5.2, Improper Waste Receptacle Placement. Violation Code 8.1, Failure to maintain approved landscaping standards. Rachel read it twice, then a third time, certain she was missing something. She'd been in the house for exactly 36 hours. The moving boxes were still stacked in most rooms. She hadn't modified anything. The waste receptacles were exactly where the previous owners had left them, and the landscaping, and she hadn't even had time to touch the garden yet. She looked up at Barbara's house next door. The curtains in the front window shifted almost imperceptibly. just enough to let Rachel know she was being observed, studied, like a specimen under glass. Maya called from inside asking about breakfast, and Rachel folded the citation into her pocket. She wouldn't let her daughter see it. Wouldn't let this poison seep into Maya's excitement about her new room, her new school, her new life. Rachel had spent too many years protecting her child from the ugliness of the world to let it invade their home now. But as she made pancakes and listened to Maya chatter about the park she'd seen down the street, Rachel's mind was already working through the problem with the same methodical approach she used in the intensive care unit. Assess the situation, identify the threat, develop a treatment plan, execute with precision. By the time she'd gotten Maya settled with cartoons and unpacking her toy box, Rachel had made 3 phone calls. The first to the city clerk's office to verify the HOA's actual authority. The second to her realtor to confirm what violations could legally be enforced during a move-in period. The third to a friend from medical school whose husband practiced property law. The answers she received were both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The HOA could issue citations, yes, but everything on this particular notice was either premature, unenforceable during the standard 30-day move-in grace period, or entirely fabricated. The exterior modifications clause, for instance, required photographic evidence of changes made by the new owner. The landscaping standard couldn't be applied until the end of the first growing season. This wasn't enforcement, this was harassment. And it was just beginning. Over the next 4 days, Rachel began to understand the full scope of Barbara Whitmore's campaign. A noise complaint was filed on Tuesday evening, claiming loud music at 11 p.m. when Rachel and Maya had been asleep since 9. On Wednesday, Rachel received a certified letter stating that her vehicle registration didn't match the approved resident database, despite having submitted all required documentation the day after closing. Thursday brought an anonymous complaint to the city about unpermitted construction, triggering an inspector's visit that found absolutely nothing amiss, but still disrupted Rachel's entire afternoon. Each incident was small enough to seem petty, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Barbara Whitmore wasn't just unwelcoming. She was waging a calculated war of attrition designed to exhaust, frustrate, and ultimately drive Rachel away. What disturbed Rachel most wasn't the harassment itself. She'd faced worse in her life, overcome obstacles that made HOA violations look trivial by comparison. What disturbed her was watching other neighbors witness it and say nothing. The couple across the street who smiled and waved but wouldn't meet her eyes when Barbara was outside. The retired teacher 2 houses down, who'd seemed friendly until Barbara had a very public conversation with her by the mailboxes. After that, the woman stopped returning Rachel's greetings entirely. Fear had a smell in this neighborhood. It hung in the air like humidity, making everything feel heavier than it should. Rachel was pulling weeds from the front garden on Saturday morning, trying to get ahead of any legitimate landscaping complaints, when she noticed the car. A sleek black sedan parked across the street, engine running, windows tinted dark. It had been there for 20 minutes. Just sitting. Just watching. She was debating whether to approach it when an elderly man emerged from the house next to where the car was parked. He was probably in his 80s, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had become fragile with age. He wore gardening gloves and carried pruning shears, clearly heading for his rose bushes. The man paused when he saw Rachel, and something complicated crossed his face. Not hostility, not quite sympathy either. Something closer to regret. "You're the Harper woman," he said, not a question. "Rachel." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Rachel Harper. He nodded slowly, studying her the way her professors used to study X-rays, looking for something beneath the surface. "William Chen. I've lived here 42 years. The black sedan pulled away suddenly, tires barely making a sound on the pavement. Rachel watched it disappear around the corner, then looked back at William. "That's the 3rd time this week," he said quietly. "Private investigator. Barbara hires them sometimes, when she really wants someone gone. The casual way he said it, like he was commenting on the weather, made Rachel's stomach turn. That's illegal. Lots of things are illegal. William moved toward his roses, began examining them with a practiced eye. Doesn't mean they don't happen, especially when the person doing them has money, connections, and no shame. Rachel crossed the small strip of lawn between their properties, lowering her voice. Why are you telling me this? Because you should know what you're up against. He selected a dead branch and snipped it with surprising strength. And because I'm old enough that Barbara can't hurt me anymore. Already pushed my wife out of the neighborhood before she died. Already made life hell for my kids when they visit. Can't take anything else from me that matters. The bitterness in his voice was profound and well-earned. Rachel felt a surge of kinship with this man, this stranger who'd suffered under the same tyranny she was only beginning to experience. There was another family. William continued, not looking at her. 3 years ago, nice people. Had a daughter about your girl's age. Barbara decided they didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. Started with citations, moved to investigations, ended with their dog being poisoned. They couldn't prove it, but everyone knew. They left 2 months later. Rachel's hands clenched at her sides. Why hasn't anyone stopped her? How? William finally met her eyes, and they were tired in a way that transcended physical exhaustion. She's president of the HOA. She's on the City Planning Commission. Her late husband was a judge, and half the lawyers in this county owe their careers to connections he made. She has power, Ms. Harper, real power, the kind that doesn't show up in bylaws or legal statutes. There has to be something. There is. He turned back to his roses, but his voice carried clearly. There's truth. Barbara's power comes from people being too afraid to challenge her version of things. Too afraid to dig into why she really cares so much about who lives where. Too afraid to ask uncomfortable questions. Rachel was about to respond when Maya's voice rang out from inside the house, calling for her. William made a small gesture, a dismissal that was somehow also an encouragement. Be careful, he said. But don't back down. Some fights are worth having, even when they're hard. Rachel walked back to her house with her mind racing. That evening, after Maya was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and began to research. Not HOA bylaws this time, not property law. She researched Barbara Whitmore herself. The woman had an impressive public profile, charitable work, community leadership, multiple awards for neighborhood beautification, photos of her with local politicians, business leaders, council members. She was, by all appearances, a pillar of the community. But Rachel had spent enough years in medicine to know that impressive exteriors often concealed complicated interiors. She dug deeper. Old newspaper archives, property records, court filings. And slowly, piece by piece, a different picture began to emerge. Barbara had lived in this neighborhood for 28 years. Her husband had died 7 years ago, leaving her a considerable fortune and even more considerable influence. But before that, in the early years of their marriage, there was a gap. A 5-year period where Barbara Whitmore seemed to simply not exist in any public record. Rachel cross-referenced the dates with property records and found something interesting. The house Barbara now lived in had been purchased by her husband alone in 1997. But marriage records showed they'd been married since 1994. 3 years of marriage before Barbara's name appeared on any property deed. 3 years where she lived somewhere else, or was someone else. It was past midnight when Rachel finally found it. A news article from a small paper in a town 3 hours away. 1995. A discrimination lawsuit filed against a landlord named Barbara Whitmore Chen. The case had been settled out of court, details sealed, but the plaintiff's name was listed. Marcus Thompson. Rachel stared at the screen, her medical training instinctively cataloging details. The name, Chen. William's last name, the sealed settlement, the gap in Barbara's public history. She reached for her phone, hesitated, then texted William despite the late hour. "Did Barbara ever go by Whitmore Chen?" The response came surprisingly quickly. "My cousin, married my wife's brother, disowned by the family after the lawsuit. Why?" Rachel's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for more information about Marcus Thompson. What she found made her breath catch in her throat. The lawsuit wasn't just about discrimination. It was about systematic harassment of minority tenants, about falsified maintenance complaints, about coordinated efforts to drive specific families out of specific properties. The pattern was identical to what Rachel was experiencing now, down to the private investigators, down to the cascade of baseless citations. Barbara hadn't just done this before. She'd perfected it, but the lawsuit had exposed her, cost her family connections, cost her the life she'd been building in that other town. She changed her name back to Whitmore, moved here, reinvented herself as a community leader. Rachel sat back in her chair, understanding crystallizing like ice in her veins. Barbara wasn't just a racist neighbor protecting property values. She was someone whose entire current life was built on escaping the consequences of her past actions. Someone who would go to extraordinary lengths to prevent anyone from uncovering that truth. And Rachel had just uncovered it. Retry VT. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Rachel found herself sitting in her car outside the county courthouse, watching the first employees arrive for work. She'd been there since 5:30, running on 3 hours of sleep and a determination that burned hotter than exhaustion. The information she'd uncovered about Barbara wasn't just damning, it was a roadmap, a blueprint of tactics, patterns and vulnerabilities. But knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. She needed proof, documentation, something concrete enough to shatter the carefully constructed facade Barbara had spent decades building. The archives department opened at 8. Rachel was the first person through the door, her credentials from the hospital still clipped to her scrubs from the night shift she'd just finished. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked up from her computer with practiced efficiency. "I need to pull sealed court records," Rachel said, sliding a formal request form across the counter. She'd spent 2 hours before her shift learning the exact legal language required. Case number 95-3721. Thompson versus Whitmore Chen, 1995. The clerk's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Recognition, maybe, or caution. Sealed records require a court order or involvement from one of the original parties. "I'm aware." Rachel kept her voice level, professional. "I'm filing as an affected party in a pattern of ongoing harassment. The precedent case is directly relevant to current discriminatory practices by the defendant. It wasn't technically legal standing yet, but it was close enough to make the clerk pause, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. The woman studied Rachel for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them. A recognition that went beyond bureaucratic procedure. The clerk had seen this before. Women fighting systems designed to exhaust them, people seeking justice through channels that were deliberately complicated and obscure. "I can't unseal the records," the clerk said carefully. "But I can tell you that all settlements filed in this county are logged with basic information in public registries. Amount paid, parties involved, general category of complaint. Those summaries aren't sealed." She turned her monitor slightly, just enough for Rachel to see the screen. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with deliberate slowness, pulling up the case file summary. Rachel's eyes scanned the information rapidly, her medical training making her naturally adept at processing complex data quickly. Settlement amount, $350,000. Complaint category, housing discrimination, tenant harassment, fraudulent documentation, conspiracy to deprive civil rights. Additional parties named: Whitmore Property Management LLC, 7 subsidiary corporations. Duration of discriminatory practices, approximately 8 years. 8 years. Barbara hadn't just harassed a few tenants. She'd run an entire operation designed to systematically exclude and extract money from vulnerable renters. The settlement had bankrupted her property management company, dissolved her subsidiaries, and apparently ended her first attempt at building a real estate empire. The plaintiff, Rachel said quietly, memorizing every detail on the screen. Marcus Thompson. Is there any way to locate him? The clerk's expression remained neutral, but she pulled out a business card from her desk drawer. There's a community advocacy center on Elm Street. They help people who've experienced housing discrimination. Sometimes they stay in touch with previous plaintiffs for support groups, resources. She handed Rachel the card. They might have information I couldn't access from here. Rachel understood. This woman was helping her navigate around the barriers Barbara's money and connections had erected, showing her the paths that existed in the shadows of official channels. Thank you, Rachel said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. Back in her car, Rachel sat with the business card in one hand and her phone in the other. Maya would be waking up soon, would need breakfast and attention, and the kind of uncomplicated morning routine that made 5-year-olds feel secure. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that time was compressing, that Barbara was already planning her next move, that every moment of hesitation gave her opponent more opportunity to strike. She called her mother. Mom, I need you to come stay for a few days. Help with Maya. Something's come up. Her mother, who'd raised 3 children while working 2 jobs and never once complained about the weight of it, simply said, I'll be there by noon. The Community Advocacy Center occupied a converted house on the east side of town, in a neighborhood Rachel recognized from her childhood. The paint was peeling slightly, the sign out front modest and hand-painted. But the woman who greeted her at the door had the bearing of someone who'd fought 1,000 battles and refused to surrender. I'm looking for information about Marcus Thompson, Rachel said, deciding that directness was the only approach that made sense. He filed a housing discrimination suit in 1995 against Barbara Whitmore. The woman's entire demeanor shifted. Her name was Grace Martinez, and she'd been running this center for 23 years. She led Rachel to a small office filled with filing cabinets and worn furniture that spoke of limited funding and unlimited determination. Marcus Thompson died 6 years ago, Grace said without preamble. Heart attack. He was only 59. She paused, her hands resting on a particular filing cabinet drawer. But his daughter still lives in the area. She's been trying to get people to listen to her father's story for years. Nobody wanted to hear it. Barbara Whitmore had become too powerful, too connected, too protected by the reputation she'd built. Rachel felt something cold settle in her chest. She reinvented herself. She bought herself a new life. Grace pulled out a thick folder, its edges worn from handling. With the money from her husband's family, with her late husband's connections, with the kind of strategic philanthropy that makes people forget to ask uncomfortable questions, she became the respectable Mrs. Whitmore, pillar of the community, protector of neighborhood values. The bitterness in Grace's voice was scorching. All while the families she destroyed stayed destroyed. The folder contained everything: testimonies from Marcus Thompson's case, photographs of falsified maintenance reports, documentation of intimidation tactics, letters from other tenants who'd experienced similar treatment but were too afraid to come forward. And at the bottom, a worn newspaper clipping from a local paper dated 7 years ago. The headline read, "Prominent Judge Robert Whitmore dies at 68. The article detailed his distinguished career, his charitable work, his loving wife Barbara. But there was one paragraph near the end that made Rachel's hands shake slightly as she read it. Judge Whitmore had been instrumental in reforming housing court procedures, the article noted, making it easier for landlords to remove problematic tenants. His wife, Barbara, had been deeply involved in his work, often consulting on cases involving property disputes and neighborhood standards. Together, they'd shaped policy that, the article claimed, protected property values and community integrity. Rachel looked up at Grace. He helped her legitimize it, made it legal, made it policy. He gave her the tools to do everything she'd done before, but within the system this time. Grace's expression was carved from stone. She learned from getting caught, learned how to use rules and regulations and official procedures to achieve the same discriminatory goals, just wrapped it in the language of property values and community standards and aesthetic guidelines. The door to the office opened, and a woman in her mid-30s entered. She had her father's eyes, Rachel could tell from the photos in the folder. Strong, determined, carrying the weight of unfinished business. "This is Diana Thompson," Grace said, "Marcus's daughter." Diana studied Rachel with an intensity that felt like an X-ray. "Grace called me, said someone was finally asking questions about Barbara Whitmore." She moved closer, and Rachel could see the years of frustration etched into the set of her jaw. "Are you just curious? Or are you actually going to do something about it?" "She's trying to force me out of my home," Rachel said simply. "Using the exact same tactics your father documented. I found the case records, the settlement summary, the pattern." "Then you're the fourth family in the past decade," Diana said. "That I know about. There are probably more. She's careful now. Targets people who are isolated, who don't have networks or resources, who look like easy victims." She pulled out her phone, swiping through screens until she found what she wanted. "The family before you lasted 6 weeks. The one before that, 3 months. Barbara doesn't just want you gone. She wants you broken, wants you to leave knowing you were beaten." Rachel thought about Maya, about the excitement in her daughter's voice when she talked about her new room, her new school. Thought about the years of work and sacrifice that had gone into making this move possible. Thought about every other family that had been driven out, their dreams crushed under the weight of Barbara's calculated cruelty. "What if we didn't leave?" Rachel asked. "What if we exposed her instead?" Diana's laugh was sharp and painful. "With what? The case is sealed. My father's testimony is inadmissible without the full court record. Barbara's husband destroyed or suppressed most of the other evidence. The families who suffered are scattered, afraid, unwilling to relive the trauma. And Barbara has an entire neighborhood full of people who benefit from her keeping out anyone who doesn't fit their preferred aesthetic." "But she made a mistake," Rachel said, the realization crystallizing even as she spoke. "She assumed I'd be like the others, isolated, alone, easy to intimidate." She met Diana's eyes. "I'm a nurse in the intensive care unit. I've held people's lives in my hands. I've made decisions in seconds that mean the difference between living and dying. And I've spent 15 years learning how to stay calm when everything is falling apart." Grace was watching her with something that might have been hope. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Barbara's power comes from people being afraid to challenge her publicly, from everyone knowing what she is, but nobody being willing to say it out loud." Rachel pulled out her phone, opening the voice recorder app. "Diana, would you be willing to tell your father's story, on record, with the understanding that I might make it public?" Diana didn't hesitate. "I've been waiting years for someone to ask." Over the next 2 hours, Rachel recorded everything. Diana's testimony about her father's experience, the systematic harassment he'd endured, the falsified complaints and manufactured violations. Grace added documentation from other cases the advocacy center had handled, patterns of discrimination that painted a picture far broader than any single incident. And Rachel contributed her own evidence. The citations, the private investigator, William Chen's corroboration, the timeline that showed Barbara deploying identical tactics decades apart. It was past 2 in the afternoon when Rachel finally left the center, her phone full of recordings, her email full of scanned documents, her mind full of a strategy that was either brilliant or catastrophically reckless. Her mother had texted twice to confirm Maya was fine, was having lunch, was happily playing with the toys they'd unpacked. Rachel sat in her car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. She could still back down, could still pack up, take whatever loss she'd incur on selling the house so quickly, move somewhere else, somewhere easier, somewhere that didn't require fighting battles that weren't technically hers to fight. But then she thought about Diana Thompson, carrying her father's story for years with nobody willing to listen. Thought about William Chen, trapped in a neighborhood that had poisoned his wife's final years. Thought about the families she'd never meet, the ones who'd been broken and scattered by Barbara's methodical cruelty. And she thought about Maya, growing up in a world where people like Barbara Whitmore operated with impunity, where power and money and calculated respectability could mask systematic discrimination, where staying silent was safer than speaking truth. Rachel started the car and drove toward home, but she made one stop along the way. A local television station, Channel 7, the same station that had run a series on housing discrimination the previous year. The same station whose investigative reporter had won an award for exposing predatory lending practices in minority communities. The receptionist looked skeptical when Rachel asked to speak with someone from the investigative team. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Rachel said, "but I have documentation of a decades-long pattern of housing discrimination by a prominent community leader, including sealed court settlements, witness testimony, and evidence of ongoing harassment, and I'm willing to go on record." The receptionist's fingers paused over her keyboard. "Wait here." 20 minutes later, Rachel was sitting across from a reporter named Sarah Chen. No relation to William, but the coincidence still felt meaningful, explaining everything she'd uncovered. Sarah listened with the focused intensity of someone who recognized a real story when she heard one, taking notes, asking pointed questions, her expression growing more serious with each new detail. "This is extensive," Sarah said finally, "but it's also dangerous. Barbara Whitmore has serious connections. Going public with this will trigger a response. Legal threats, character assassination. She'll come at you with everything she has." "She's already coming at me with everything she has," Rachel said. "The only difference is whether she does it in the shadows or in the light." Sarah studied her for a long moment. "You're sure about this? Once we start investigating, once we start asking questions publicly, there's no taking it back." Rachel thought about the little girl waiting at home, playing with toys in a house that should have been a sanctuary but had become a battleground. Thought about all the other little girls and boys whose families had been driven out, who'd learned that some doors would always be closed to them, that some neighborhoods would always find reasons to reject them. "I'm sure," she said. What Rachel didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she drove home that evening, feeling something like hope kindling in her chest, was that Barbara Whitmore had already heard about her visit to the advocacy center, that her network of connections and informants had already reported back, that even now Barbara was sitting in her pristine living room, making phone calls to lawyers and city officials and anyone else who owed her favors, and that the real war was about to begin. Retry VT. The phone started ringing at 6:43 the next morning. Rachel was already awake, had been since 5, unable to sleep through the anticipation that hummed through her body like electricity. She didn't recognize the number, but something about the early hour and the persistence of the caller made her answer despite her better judgment. "Ms. Harper." The voice was male, smooth, practiced in the art of sounding both friendly and vaguely threatening. "My name is Walter Brennan. I'm an attorney representing the Maple Grove Homeowners Association. I understand you've been making some rather serious allegations about one of our board members." Rachel's grip tightened on the phone. She'd expected pushback, but not this quickly. not before Sarah Chen had even begun her formal investigation. I haven't made any allegations. I've simply provided factual information to a journalist. Factual. The word dripped with condescension. Ms. Harper, I'd strongly advise you to reconsider whatever course of action you're planning. Defamation is a serious matter. So is harassment. Mrs. Whitmore has been a respected member of this community for nearly 3 decades. She has an impeccable reputation, extensive documentation of her charitable work, and considerable resources to protect herself against baseless attacks. Are you threatening me, Mr. Brennan? I'm advising you. His tone shifted, became almost paternal. You've just moved into a new home. You have a daughter to think about. Legal battles are expensive, exhausting, and often end badly for the person who initiates them, especially when that person is new to the community and lacks the kind of support networks that make these fights sustainable. Rachel moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street as morning light began to paint the houses in shades of gold and amber. Barbara's house stood silent and perfect, not a single shutter out of place, the lawn immaculate even in early November. Is there anything else, Mr. Brennan? Just this. The friendliness evaporated from his voice entirely. We're prepared to offer you a solution, a graceful exit. We have a buyer interested in your property. They're willing to pay 15% above what you paid, covering all your transaction costs and moving expenses. You walk away with a profit, no legal entanglements, no drawn-out conflict. All you have to do is sign the papers and stop talking to reporters. The offer was sophisticated in its cruelty, designed to look generous while making the subtext crystal clear. Take the money and disappear, or face the full weight of Barbara's machine. Rachel wondered how many others had received similar calls, had calculated the odds, and chosen the path of least resistance. Tell Mrs. Whitmore I'm not interested, Rachel said, and tell her that every action she takes from this point forward will be documented and added to the public record. She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Maya was still asleep, her grandmother dozing in the guest room, the house wrapped in the kind of peaceful quiet that felt increasingly precious. Rachel knew that peace was temporary. The storm was gathering and she'd just declined the last lifeboat. The next call came from her realtor at 8:15. Rachel, what the hell is going on? I've had 3 calls this morning about your property, one from the HOA attorney, one from someone claiming to represent a buyer, and one from the title company saying there might be issues with your deed. Issues with my deed? Rachel's stomach dropped. What kind of issues? They were vague. Something about a disputed easement that might affect the property boundaries. But Rachel, I reviewed that title search myself. It was clean. This is... Her realtor's voice dropped. This is someone manufacturing problems, creating complications where none existed. It was brilliant, in a twisted way. Barbara couldn't force Rachel out through harassment alone, not now that reporters were watching. So she was attacking the foundation of the purchase itself, creating enough legal ambiguity to make the property unsellable, unmortgageable, effectively worthless, until the issues were resolved through expensive legal channels that could take months or years. Can they do that? Rachel asked, though she already knew the answer. They can try. With the right connections at the title company, the right pressure applied in the right places, they can create enough smoke to make people think there's fire. Her realtor sighed, the sound heavy with frustration and something that might have been guilt. I'm sorry, Rachel. I didn't know you were moving into a war zone. By noon, Rachel's mother was insisting she eat something, pressing a sandwich into her hands, while Maya colored at the kitchen table, blissfully unaware of the siege forming around them. Rachel took a bite just to satisfy her mother, but her mind was elsewhere, tracking the moves on the chessboard, trying to anticipate Barbara's next strike. It came at 2:30, in the form of a visit from Child Protective Services. Rachel opened the door to find a young woman with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. introducing herself as Amanda Pierce from CPS. "I'm sorry to bother you, Ms. Harper, but we received a report of concerning conditions at this residence. I'm required to follow up on all reports involving minor children." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. "What kind of concerns?" Amanda consulted her notes, clearly uncomfortable. "The report claims there are exposed wires creating electrical hazards, blocked exits that could prevent emergency evacuation, and inadequate sleeping arrangements for the child residing here. I need to conduct a visual inspection of the premises." Rachel's mother appeared behind her, Maya clutching her hand, and Rachel saw understanding flash across her mother's face. This wasn't about child safety. This was about using the most devastating weapon available, threatening a mother's custody of her child. "Come in," Rachel said, her voice eerily calm despite the rage building beneath her professional exterior. "You'll find that every single claim in that report is fabricated." The inspection took 20 minutes. Amanda moved through each room methodically, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. The wiring was up to code, recently inspected as part of the home purchase. The exits were clear, the smoke detectors functional. Maya's room properly furnished with a new bed and age-appropriate everything. By the end, Amanda's apologetic expression had transformed into something harder, more knowing. "There's nothing here," she said, lowering her clipboard. "Not even close to the conditions described in the report. Ms. Harper, I shouldn't tell you this, but..." She glanced toward where Maya was showing Rachel's mother a drawing, lowered her voice. "This is the third, obviously false report I've investigated in this neighborhood in the past 2 years, all involving families that ended up moving away shortly after. I can't prove anything, and my supervisor won't let me document a pattern, but if I were you, I'd be very careful. Whoever is doing this has no boundaries. They're willing to weaponize child protection to achieve their goals." After Amanda left, Rachel found herself sitting on the floor of Maya's room, watching her daughter arrange stuffed animals on her bed, explaining to each one how this was their new home now, and they should be brave even though it was different. The innocence of it, the trust that her mother would keep her safe, and that homes were places of security rather than battlefields, nearly broke something in Rachel. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sarah Chen. "Just got word that my editor is getting cold feet. Barbara's lawyer sent a letter threatening a lawsuit if we run anything without absolute ironclad proof. They're claiming you're a disgruntled resident with a vendetta. Need to move faster than I thought. Can you meet tomorrow morning? 8 a.m., my office?" Rachel texted back a confirmation, then sat in the dimming afternoon light, feeling the walls of her new home press in around her. Barbara had escalated faster and more viciously than Rachel had anticipated. The deed complications, the CPS report, the legal threats against the television station. These weren't the actions of someone protecting her reputation. These were the actions of someone who knew she was cornered and was willing to destroy everything in her path rather than be exposed. That evening, after Maya was asleep and her mother had retired to the guest room, Rachel stood at her kitchen window and watched lights flicker on in Barbara's house. She could see movement behind the windows, shadows passing back and forth, and wondered what conversations were happening in that perfect house. What strategies were being refined? What weapons were being prepared for deployment? Her phone rang again. This time it was William Chen. "They came to my house today," he said without preamble. "Code enforcement. Said they'd received reports about my property being in violation of city ordinances. My property that I've maintained meticulously for 42 years. His voice was shaking with anger, and Rachel realized with a start that he was calling from outside, probably from his garden where Barbara couldn't easily overhear. "She knows I talk to you. She's punishing me for it. And if she's doing this to me, she's going to come at you 10 times harder." "I know," Rachel said. "She already is." "Then you need to understand something." William's tone shifted, became urgent. "Barbara doesn't just want to win. She wants total destruction. She did it to the family 3 years ago, the ones whose dog died. She didn't stop until they'd lost money on the house sale. The husband had been fired from his job because she spread rumors to his employer, and their credit was ruined from legal fees. She salted the earth, Rachel. Made sure they couldn't recover even after they left. Rachel closed her eyes, absorbing this information, filing it away with everything else she'd learned about her opponent. Why are you telling me this? Because you should know what you're fighting. William paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle. But also because I think you might actually have a chance. You're not like the others. You're documenting everything. You're not isolated. And you've already uncovered more about Barbara's past than anyone else managed to find. He paused again. My wife, before she died, she made me promise something. She said that if anyone ever stood up to Barbara, really stood up to her, I should help them, no matter what it cost me, because someone has to stop her eventually. William, I have copies, he interrupted, of everything. 20 years of HOA records that I kept because I always knew that someday someone would need them. Documents showing how votes were manipulated, how bylaws were changed to target specific families, how money was spent to pay investigators and lawyers to harass residents. I kept it all, every piece of evidence that passed through the HOA files that I could access as a member. Rachel's heart was pounding. You're willing to give that to me? I'm willing to give it to the reporter, tomorrow, if you think she'll use it, if you think it'll make a difference. His voice cracked slightly. I'm 86 years old, Rachel. I don't have many fights left in me. But this one matters. This one I can't walk away from. They arranged the meeting. William would bring his documents to Sarah Chen's office in the morning. They'd coordinate their evidence, build a case so comprehensive that even Barbara's connections couldn't suppress it. Rachel hung up feeling something she hadn't felt in days, actual hope. She was about to head upstairs when she heard it, a sound from outside, glass breaking, sharp and clear in the quiet night. Rachel moved to the front door, her heart racing, and saw it immediately. Her car's windshield, spider-webbed with cracks, a brick lying on the hood. The streetlight illuminated the scene like a stage, and Rachel had the distinct impression that this was intentional, that she was meant to see it, meant to feel afraid. She stepped onto the porch, not caring that she was only in her pajamas, and looked directly at Barbara's house. A curtain moved in the upstairs window, just a flutter, barely perceptible, but enough to communicate everything that needed to be said. This was a warning, a demonstration of how easily Barbara could touch her life, invade her space, damage what was hers. The message was clear. Back down, or it gets worse. Rachel pulled out her phone and took photographs of the damage, of the brick, of the angle that suggested it had been thrown from the direction of Barbara's property. She documented everything with the same clinical precision she used when charting patient conditions in the ICU. Then she called the police non-emergency line and filed a report, knowing it would likely go nowhere, but creating a paper trail nonetheless. The officer who arrived 40 minutes later was polite but dismissive. Probably kids. Random vandalism. Happens sometimes in nice neighborhoods. He took a few perfunctory notes, gave her a case number, and left with the kind of disinterest that told Rachel he either didn't believe her or didn't care. She stood in her driveway after he'd gone, looking at her damaged car, feeling the November wind cut through her thin pajamas, and made a decision. Tomorrow morning she would give Sarah Chen everything. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence she'd gathered. She would tell William to do the same. They would go public with all of it, consequences be damned, because the alternative was living in fear of a woman who had already proven she had no limits. But tonight, Rachel walked back into her house and locked every door, checked every window, and stood outside Maya's room for a long moment, listening to her daughter's peaceful breathing. The sound of innocence that still believed the world was safe. That still trusted her mother to make everything okay. Rachel made a silent promise to that sleeping child. This ends. Whatever it takes, however hard it gets, this ends. No more families driven out. No more children learning that some doors will always be closed to them. No more silence protecting the powerful while the vulnerable suffer. She didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, organizing files, preparing her testimony, getting ready for the morning when everything would finally come into the light. The clock ticked toward dawn, each second bringing her closer to the moment of no return, and Rachel felt strangely calm, centered in a way she hadn't felt since arriving at this house. The storm was coming, but she was ready for it. Retry VT. The morning arrived cold and clear. The kind of November day where frost clung to windshields and every breath turned to vapor. Rachel sat in her car outside the television station at 7:30, watching employees trickle into the building with coffee cups and tired expressions. Her own hands were wrapped around a travel mug her mother had pressed into them before she left, still warm, grounding her to something solid amid the chaos of the past week. William arrived at 7:45, driving a sedan that looked older than some of Rachel's medical equipment, carrying 2 banker's boxes that he handled with the careful reverence of someone transporting something precious. He saw Rachel and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the line they were both about to cross. Together, they walked into the building that would either vindicate them or mark the beginning of their complete destruction. Sarah Chen was already in the conference room, along with her editor and the station's legal counsel. The presence of the lawyer told Rachel everything she needed to know about how seriously they were taking this and how dangerous they recognized the story to be. For the next 3 hours, they laid it all out. Diana Thompson joined them via video conference, providing her father's testimony and the documentation Grace Martinez had preserved. William's boxes yielded decades of HOA records, each document a piece of a larger mosaic of systematic exclusion. Rachel contributed her recordings, her citations, the timeline of harassment that mirrored patterns from 20 years earlier. The station's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who looked like she'd spent her entire career preparing for exactly this kind of fight, asked the hardest questions. Could they prove intent? Could they demonstrate pattern and practice? Could they protect their sources from retaliation? With each question, Sarah and her editor cross-referenced documents, verified dates, confirmed details that would transform allegations into evidence. By 11 o'clock, Patricia leaned back in her chair and removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose in a gesture that Rachel recognized from countless long shifts. Exhaustion mixed with determination. "This is going to get ugly," she said. "Barbara Whitmore has resources and connections that most people can only imagine. But what you've presented here is the kind of story that matters, the kind that changes things. If we're doing this, we do it right, and we do it now, before she has time to bury it." Sarah looked at Rachel. "Are you ready for what comes next? The moment this airs, your life becomes public. Your name, your face, your story. Barbara will come after you legally, personally, professionally. She'll dig into every corner of your past looking for ammunition. Are you prepared for that?" Rachel thought about Maya, about the conversation she'd had with her daughter that morning over breakfast. She'd kept it simple, age-appropriate, but honest. "Mommy has to do something hard today," she'd said. "Something that might make some people upset. But it's the right thing to do, even when it's scary. Do you understand?" And Maya, with the clarity that children sometimes possess, had nodded and said, "Like when I told the teacher that Emma was being mean to the new girl, even though Emma said she wouldn't be my friend anymore if I told." "I'm ready," Rachel said. The story aired 3 days later during the evening news, a 12-minute investigative segment that Sarah had titled, "The Price of Belonging." It opened with Diana Thompson describing her father's battle against Barbara Whitmore 2 decades earlier, his testimony about systematic harassment preserved in settlement documents that had finally found the light. It showed William Chen in his garden, speaking quietly about the 20 years he'd watched families driven away, about the wife he'd lost while living in a neighborhood that had become toxic. And it featured Rachel, standing in front of her new home, explaining in measured clinical terms what she'd experienced, what she'd uncovered, and why she'd decided to fight instead of flee. But the most devastating moment came from something none of them had anticipated. Sarah had tracked down 3 other families who'd lived on Maple Grove Lane in the past decade. Families who'd left suddenly and never spoken publicly about why. One of them, a couple named James and Linda Foster, had agreed to be interviewed. They'd lived 4 houses down from Barbara 6 years ago, had lasted exactly 9 weeks before the harassment became unbearable. What made their testimony particularly powerful was the 8mm home video footage they'd kept from the day they moved in. Excited, hopeful, their young son running through empty rooms and shouting about which one would be his. The contrast between that joy and James Foster's voice as he described finding their dog dead in the backyard, the vet finding traces of antifreeze, the police investigation that went nowhere, created a moment of television that was impossible to look away from. "We thought we were buying a home," Linda said, her voice breaking. "We were just moving into someone else's nightmare." The station's phones began ringing before the segment even finished airing. The response was seismic, comments flooding social media, other news outlets picking up the story, the mayor's office releasing a statement promising a full investigation into HOA practices across the city. But Rachel wasn't watching the fallout. She was sitting on her couch with Maya curled against her side, her mother in the armchair, the 3 of them existing in a bubble of quiet while the world outside exploded with reactions. The lawsuit arrived the next morning. Barbara Whitmore was suing Rachel, the television station, Diana Thompson, and William Chen for defamation, seeking damages in excess of $5 million. The legal papers were thick, intimidating, filled with language designed to terrify. But attached to the lawsuit was something unexpected. A formal letter from the city attorney's office informing Barbara that her role as HOA president was under investigation, and that all enforcement actions by the Maple Grove Homeowners Association were suspended pending review. 2 days after that, Rachel received a call from Patricia Okonkwo. "The DA wants to talk to you," she said. "They're considering charges. Criminal conspiracy to deprive civil rights. It's a federal statute. If they can prove a pattern of coordinated harassment based on protected characteristics, Barbara could face actual prison time." Rachel sat with that information, trying to process it. She'd wanted exposure, accountability, an end to the cycle of harassment. But the possibility of criminal charges felt both vindicating and strangely hollow. "Will it stick?" she asked. "With what we've documented? With testimony from multiple victims spanning 2 decades, it has a real chance." Patricia paused. "But Rachel, you should know, Barbara's attorney reached out this morning, unofficially. They want to discuss a settlement, a public apology, resignation from the HOA, monetary compensation for you and the other families. They're trying to avoid criminal prosecution. What do you think I should do?" "That's not my decision to make. But I can tell you what usually happens in cases like this. The powerful person offers just enough to make the problem go away, avoids any real consequences, and 5 years later, they're doing the same thing somewhere else under a different name." Patricia's voice hardened. "Or you can refuse the settlement, cooperate with the criminal investigation, and risk a trial that could take years and isn't guaranteed to succeed. There's no easy answer here." Rachel spent that evening in her garden, the one she'd barely had time to tend since moving in. The plants were overgrown, weeds choking the flower beds. But there was something about the work of pulling up the unwanted growth that felt meditative. Maya helped, her small hands earnest as she tugged at dandelions, asking questions about which plants were good and which were bad, trying to understand the difference. Sometimes plants that look pretty are actually hurting the garden, Rachel explained, showing her daughter how morning glory vines were strangling a rosebush. They take up all the space and nutrients so the other plants can't grow. You have to remove them, even though it's hard work, so the garden can be healthy. Maya studied the tangled vines seriously. Is Mrs. Whitmore like the bad plants? The question was so direct, so innocent, that Rachel had to pause before answering. Mrs. Whitmore did things that hurt people, things that weren't fair or right, and now people are trying to figure out how to make sure she doesn't hurt anyone else. Will she say sorry? Rachel looked at her daughter, at the hope in those young eyes, and felt the weight of the decision she still had to make. Sorry wasn't enough. An apology couldn't undo the years of damage, couldn't restore the families who'd been scattered, couldn't bring back William Chen's wife or the Foster's dog or Marcus Thompson's health. But maybe it could prevent the next family from going through the same thing. Maybe it could create enough public awareness that other Barbara Whitmores in other neighborhoods would think twice before deploying their arsenals of harassment. She declined the settlement offer. 3 weeks later, federal charges were filed. The trial took place the following spring, and Rachel testified for 6 hours over 2 days. She described the citations, the private investigator, the CPS report, the brick through her windshield. Diana Thompson testified about her father's ordeal and the 20 years she'd spent trying to hold Barbara accountable. William Chen, despite his age, gave testimony that was precise and damning, walking the jury through decades of HOA records that showed unmistakable patterns of targeting. The Fosters described their experience, their voices steady but their pain evident. Barbara's defense was predictable. She was a dedicated community servant protecting property values. These were all coincidences or exaggerations. Racial bias had nothing to do with her legitimate concerns about neighborhood standards. Her attorneys were expensive and skilled, poking holes where they could, suggesting alternative explanations, painting Barbara as the victim of a coordinated campaign. But in the end, the jury saw what Rachel had seen from the beginning. A pattern spanning decades, a systematic approach to exclusion wrapped in the language of community standards. The intent might be difficult to prove in any single incident, but the totality of evidence painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The verdict came back guilty on 4 counts of conspiracy to deprive civil rights. Barbara Whitmore, pillar of the community, respected HOA president, prominent philanthropist, was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to the families she'd harmed. Rachel wasn't in the courtroom when the sentence was read. She was at home, planting a garden with Maya, working the soil that was finally truly theirs. She learned about the verdict from a text message and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph or vindication, but a quiet, profound sense of completion. That evening, William Chen knocked on her door holding a pie his late wife used to make. The recipe written in faded handwriting on a card he showed Rachel with trembling hands. They ate it together on her porch, watching the sun set over Maple Grove Lane, and William told stories about his wife, about the neighborhood before Barbara had poisoned it, about the hope he'd almost forgotten could exist here. "You know what the saddest part is?" he said as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and violet. "She could have just welcomed you, could have baked you a pie like I'm doing now, could have offered to show Maya where the good playground is, could have been the neighbor that good neighborhoods are supposed to have. It would have cost her nothing, less than nothing, would have brought her more respect than all her manufactured reputation ever did." Rachel thought about that, about the extraordinary amount of energy Barbara had expended on hatred, when even a fraction of that effort applied to kindness could have created something beautiful. Why do you think she didn't? William was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of observation. Because she believed belonging was a finite resource, that if someone different was allowed in, it somehow took something away from her. She never understood that neighborhoods, communities, they're not pies that get smaller when you share them. They're gardens that grow bigger and more beautiful the more diverse the planting becomes. Rachel looked at her own garden, at the riot of colors and textures she and Maya had been cultivating. Roses next to wildflowers, carefully tended sections beside deliberately wild areas. Different, but harmonious, growing together in soil that had room for all of them. 3 months after the trial, Rachel was working a night shift when she got a call from Diana Thompson. "I wanted you to know," Diana said. "My dad's case, the sealed records, they're being unsealed. Part of the restitution agreement. Everything he documented, everything he fought for, it's going to be part of the public record now. And the city is using it to reform HOA oversight across the entire county. Mandatory audits, restrictions on enforcement powers, protections for residents filing complaints. They're calling it the Marcus Thompson Act." Rachel sat in the quiet of the hospital break room, surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the soft rush of ventilators, and felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed during the entire ordeal finally break free. Marcus Thompson's name would mean something now, would protect people he'd never meet, would ensure that his suffering hadn't been meaningless. He would have liked that, Diana said quietly. He would have been proud. That summer, the neighborhood began to change. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. A family from Ethiopia moved into the house 3 doors down. A couple from the Philippines bought the property across the street. The white families who'd stayed through the trial, who'd testified about the climate of fear Barbara had created, seemed lighter somehow, freed from the weight of complicity. Block parties started happening. Maya made friends with children who looked like her and children who didn't. All of them just kids playing in a neighborhood that was learning how to be what it should have been all along. Rachel sometimes saw the house next door, Barbara's former fortress, and thought about the woman who'd tried so hard to keep her out. Barbara was serving her sentence at a minimum security facility 2 hours away. And Rachel had heard through William that she'd received divorce papers from her second husband, that her name had been removed from the boards of every charitable organization she'd served. The fall from grace had been total and public. Rachel didn't take satisfaction in it exactly, but she didn't mourn it either. There were consequences to building your life on cruelty, to weaponizing power against the vulnerable, to choosing exclusion over embrace. Barbara had made those choices consistently for decades, and now she was living with the results. On a warm evening in late August, nearly a year after she'd first turned the key in her front door, Rachel sat on her porch with a glass of wine and watched her daughter chase fireflies with the neighborhood children. Their laughter was unself-conscious, joyful, the sound of belonging that required no qualification or defense. William was in his garden, waving occasionally when he caught Rachel's eye. The Ethiopian family was having a barbecue, and the smell of Berber spices drifted through the warm air, mixing with someone else's grilled corn and the ever-present scent of cut grass. This was what home was supposed to feel like. Not just a house you owned, but a place where you belonged, where your presence was welcome, where your daughter could grow up understanding that she had every right to take up space in the world, that her existence wasn't something that needed justifying or defending. Rachel thought about the question Maya had asked her in the garden so many months ago about whether Barbara would say sorry. Barbara never had apologized. Not really. Even in court, her statement had been carefully worded, legally strategic, empty of genuine remorse. And Rachel had realized that she didn't need Barbara's apology, didn't need her acknowledgement or her understanding or her permission to exist in this space. What she needed, what they'd all needed, was for the truth to be spoken aloud, for the pattern to be named and recognized, for the systems that enabled systematic exclusion to be dismantled and rebuilt with accountability woven into their foundation. The apology, if it ever came, would be in the form of changed policies, protected rights, communities learning to build themselves on inclusion rather than exclusion. As darkness fell and the fireflies grew brighter against the deepening sky, Rachel thought about all the families who'd been driven from places they'd hoped to call home. Thought about Marcus Thompson and the justice that had come too late for him but might arrive in time for others. Thought about the simple, profound act of refusing to be moved, of standing firm not just for yourself, but for everyone who'd come before and everyone who'd come after. There was a lesson in all of this, though Rachel wasn't sure she had the words to fully capture it. Something about how the hardest stands we take are often for the simplest things. The right to live where we choose. The right to raise our children in safety. The right to exist without constantly proving our worth. These shouldn't be revolutionary demands, and yet they so often are. And maybe that was the real story. Not about one racist neighbor or one brave family, but about the everyday courage required to insist that the world live up to its promises. To refuse the graceful exits and the settlements that protect the powerful while keeping the truth buried. To understand that sometimes the only way through is directly through, even when every instinct screams to find an easier path. Maya called to her from the lawn, excited about a particularly bright firefly she'd almost caught, and Rachel set down her wine glass to join her daughter in the warm darkness. Above them, stars were beginning to emerge, ancient light traveling impossible distances to reach this small yard on this ordinary street where extraordinary things had happened because one woman had decided that she belonged here. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. Not a perfect resolution or a complete victory, but the persistent, defiant act of claiming space in a world that so often tried to deny it. Of planting gardens in hostile soil and tending them until they bloomed. Of teaching the next generation that home wasn't something you asked permission to have, but something you built with your own hands and defended with your whole heart. The fireflies danced. The children laughed. And on Maple Grove Lane, for perhaps the first time in decades, the word neighbor meant something close to what it should have meant all along. Retry VT.